My name is Keith Corder, Business Development Manager of Managed IT Services at Revolution Group, and your moderator today. A few housekeeping items before we get started in the webinar. Everyone is in listen-only mode, but as questions arise, please do type them in the chat section in the sidebar, and we'll address them towards the end of the presentation. And we'll also send a recording of this presentation to attendees in the coming days as well. The pandemic this year has had a major effect on all of us, and it has impacted our organizations and businesses in a major way. So the purpose of today's webinar is to provide a practical and useful information from a technology and financial perspective to help your businesses be prepared for future events. Our agenda today is pretty straightforward and to the point. First, we'll cover the shift we are seeing in the business in terms of workforce enablement, business continuity, and security. And following that, we'll dive into the financial side of things and discuss the lessons learned, specifically taking stock of where you are today, your cash flow and access to capital, and then finally touching on revenue and managing risk. And finally, towards the end, we will address questions at the end, and we encourage you all to submit them throughout the webinar. To discuss these topics are two experts from two leading companies in their respective fields. For those not familiar, Revolution Group is a leading IT consulting firm in Westerville that helps your business implement effective and innovative technology solutions. And joining me from Revolution Group is Brian Shea, who is Revolution Group's Chief Information Officer and Director of Technology Services. Brian has been in the IT field for over 25 years with a focus on IT strategy, operations, and cybersecurity. Our partner company for this webinar is FocusCFO. FocusCFO is a firm who helps business owners gain control over three key financial categories: increasing cash flow, reducing risk, and creating a platform for scalable growth. And joining us from FocusCFO is Darren, Area President. Darren has worked for years as a trusted advisor to owners and helping them to minimize challenges and maximize company value. Thank you both for joining us. And with that, I'd like to turn it over first to Brian Shea of Revolution Group to discuss the shift in IT.
Thanks, Keith. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate everybody's time. As Keith said, we could go ahead and move one slide forward. But what I plan on talking about are a couple key areas and how it really impacts small to medium businesses specifically. Especially, it's very pertinent to what's been going on with all of our industries with regards to COVID. So since March. So some of these topics aren't necessarily new topics, but some of these topics have been really brought to the forefront with the change in technology. My plan is I have a couple slides here to share with you. It's not to go through these slides line by line, but I'm having them there more as a visual representation. So as I talk on different points, you can kind of see as I'm walking through this a little bit. So kind of the first topic here, remote workforce enablement. And what does that mean? As I said, remote workers is not something that is new that companies have had. A lot of companies have had remote workers, let them be field techs or field appointment, sales. A lot of different people have had remote workforce where they're traveling around and using technology to access company resources. What has really occurred due to the pandemic is almost overnight, really in March, we had companies of all sizes that were having to send their workforce off, or really not even having a choice in many cases, to have their workforce go home and work remote, right? So what that meant was businesses didn't stop, operating, but there was a new way of approaching having access for the remote workforce to access company information. So a good example is a lot of companies in the past, they would have a few individuals that maybe could VPN in and access their information that was on premise or on site at their company location. And a lot of companies did that for various reasons. Some of it was from a limitation of security, they only wanted so many people to access company resources, any one point in time. Well, the industry did see a shift already ahead of time with people moving towards like Office 365 for email and things like that. So again, that wasn't something that was new. Companies were already doing it. But what was new was the speed that companies had to make the shift to have users working from home. One of the bigger things around that is what resources are they accessing? So I like to boil these things down into basics when I'm talking about kind of the technology to really simplify the process. But really, remote workforce enablement, it broke it down into the who, the what, and the how. So who was accessing, who needs to access information, what are they accessing, and how are they accessing it? So a lot of small to medium businesses did not have the luxury of having equipment, having company-owned resources at all their all their employees' homes. People that maybe had laptops and they were able to use technology, remotely already. But in a large amount, small to medium businesses, employees had their own home computer, right? And how do you continue to operate? So they were allowing employees to now connect, using their home computers, which opened up, we get further on into how do you handle that security? Because those are assets that are not in the company's control or domain to manage. So as those things started moving out, a lot of companies started taking the step of how do we manage this, right? Because the biggest question that really came out of it is, how are they accessing the information? If this information is all on-premise, on file servers, traditional file shares, or applications that might reside on equipment or hardware that is at a company site. So how are they accessing it from a home computer? And then how are we securing it? So this visual that you actually see here is just a high-level representation of where companies have come from. So if you kind of go from the left to the right, a lot of organizations had a server room, or maybe even a wiring closet that they had a few servers residing at their physical location. And I like to break things down into roles because it actually helps paint the picture as you move towards the right on what the importance is the roles. So physical servers, you probably had physical servers, or you have physical servers today running various applications, which are really the roles. So you could be running your accounting software, traditional file and folders, print services, those kind of things. Making that shift out of accessibility is when you start going towards the cloud. Everybody's heard the term, the word cloud. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people at various states. But what we found in this shift was some people were starting to dabble in this, in the cloud, and what that meant. Maybe they moved Office 365 out there, as I said, for email. Maybe they're using a software as a service where they're paying a subscription licensing fee for some sort of application that they're using, but it's technically out in the cloud, or SaaS, kind of on this picture here. People started looking at, they instantly had users now that needed to access information that was on premise, maybe file shares, and how would they access that? So this shift in technology has kind of jump-started companies really taking a look at how they run their business from an IT perspective. So that, again, that's taking a look at, if I need to continue to operate in case of a pandemic and I don't have physical access to my equipment or my software, what do we do, right? So people started to take a look at this step by step, breaking their applications down by roles and seeing what could you move out to a cloud. This to the right there, so there's this ideal design in the middle that's really just around the concept of, if you could get away from owning equipment, server assets, server infrastructure, that's where the industry is going as a whole from a technology perspective. Most companies are not in the business of owning hardware, server hardware, or that's not the business they want to be in, I should say. They want to focus on their core business operations. The hybrid to the right is really, there's no wrong answer to any of these steps that you see here. The reality is most companies, to go to the cloud, actually walk through a hybrid of some sort, right? Because there's a transitional state as you start migrating these different roles, different software applications out to the cloud. So you kind of go through this hybrid state. But some organizations, from a comfort level, maybe a cost, maybe just the way they operate, they still may have a need for some on-premise hardware to be in their facility and have some out in the cloud. So that's kind of really this hybrid state. Where this drives into, so I'll get around this here in security and compliance and business continuity, all these kind of blend together and they can become kind of gray, and organizations sometimes get paralyzed in making change because just all these dynamics. So what does this mean? Going to the cloud, how do I move everything I have today out to a cloud type infrastructure, and how do we do that? So, and especially around the security is, if I put everything out there, is it secure? Can people get to it? Am I more worried about it being not in my four walls anymore within my building? But we could debate on, those environments, the cloud environments are potentially and most likely probably more secure than the systems you may be running on premise. And that's because that they have the resources and the scalability that you cannot duplicate, as a business on premise in most cases. Now their footprint is bigger, right? Which does make them a larger attack point. A Microsoft or an Amazon, those kind of things are a larger attack footprint just because they are more prevalent out there. But in the reality is their environments are probably more secure. So it moves into business continuity a little bit, the second bullet here. So from a business continuity perspective, just in the essence of moving your systems out to cloud or SaaS, you inherently get, as I talked about, some of those economies of scale that reside in those cloud infrastructures. They just out of the box have more redundancy in infrastructure on their side than you have the capabilities of probably having yourself today without buying tons of equipment. So the business continuity perspective allows the flexibility. It really breaks down the barriers of the walls of the physical office and your physical data center that you might have. And it allows remote workforce really to open up. So really it's about, you could access information from anywhere, right? So you could be sitting in a coffee shop, you could be sitting at your home, you could be sitting in some remote workforce, you could be at a customer site. That the main goal is that you could access all of your company resources from anywhere, anytime, in a secure fashion. So the business continuity side, as I said, you start moving these roles out to, this cloud infrastructure and environment, and it allows for a little extra redundancy. Now, the biggest mistake, and a lot of people need to get past, is just because you move something to the cloud does not mean you can just kind of wipe your hands and forget it. It's out there, right? It's somebody else's infrastructure. I don't have to worry about it. Well, it's still your data, right? So if you have customer data, and it could be of various types, it could be, mission critical business data to you. It could be customer data. It could be sensitive data that's, if you're in healthcare, it could be patient information or just general PII, personal identifiable information that you wouldn't want just out to the general public, right? But putting that stuff onto those systems out there, you have the flexibility of having the redundant infrastructure, but it's also still falls under your responsibility to secure that data. You can misconfigure applications and permissions in the cloud infrastructure, just as you can misconfigure them on your own hardware if you owned it. But what it does do is open up the flexibility to be able to replicate that infrastructure more easily between cloud infrastructures, or leverage cloud type backup solutions to be able to move those around a little bit easier and not have the physical constraints that you might have had in the past by having the stuff on premise. The security and compliance side, this all feeds together for me a little bit. I'm going to move off of this slide. You could go to the next slide, but I'll still be touching back on points on this previous slide here. So when I say the shift in security and compliance, most organizations, again, are most worried about, if I open this up and I move my data out to a cloud infrastructure and I have a remote workforce that is accessing this information from anywhere or from systems that I no longer have control of. How do we handle that, and how do we address it? I like to break things down again, as I said, to the basics. Security is something that you just don't decide to do one day. Security needs to be part of your company DNA, right? It's got to be really part of who you are. And it's building a security culture within organizations. It's always about people, process, and technology. You could break down anything into those categories and those buckets, but they're all three categories that are critically important that you need to consider when you're walking through the change in technology. So not only do you have now this fundamental shift of people moving all this equipment and hardware from being an on-premise type solution out to a cloud type environment of some sort, you have the remote workforce now that's accessing this information from devices you no longer control. It could be a mobile device, their personal phone, their home workstation. But how do I still secure this information? So we really break security down in a couple buckets. So identity and access management, data protection, endpoint protection, and training, education, and compliance. Really those core areas. And again, I'm not going to go through all the bullets that are break into these different things. But as one of the most important ones, as you start to move people out to working from remote areas and accessing these cloud infrastructures that you no longer physical have control over, some of the critical things are this identity and access management piece to start, right? So how do I control who is accessed? How do I know it's really who they say they are that's accessing my information? And then how do I control what they're actually getting access to in a secure manner? A lot of people here, I'm sure most people on this call have heard of multi-factor authentication or have actually worked with multi-factor authentication. If you haven't done it at work yet, you've done it in your day-to-day environment working with logging into your bank account, right, online, where it prompts you for another device, texting you a code to your phone or some sort of application. So it's really no different. When you start moving business applications out to the cloud, you want that same kind of security mechanism to assure that a password has not been compromised. The reality is most people's passwords have been compromised at this point in time, or some sort of personal information has been breached, email address, or some common password that you may have used, or other personal identifiable information for sites you've used out there. So that information is out there. So they tell you, a lot of studies show if you implement, just by implementing multi-factor authentication, you can reduce some of those ransomware attacks by, it's like 90% because it just adds that extra layer of in the mix where they can't steal your password. Or they can steal your password, they just can't effectively use it the way that they were using it in the past. Another bullet I wanted to touch base on in here under identity and access management is this zero trust framework. So this basically starts going to the concept of you trust no one, right? You only trust unless you explicitly trust them. So you could set up a framework basically that even though your applications are out on the cloud and you may think they're susceptible because they're on this nebulous kind of environment to you that you can't physically put your hands on, you could still implement some of these technologies that you are really dictating the who and then what they're actually accessing, and based on even device that they're accessing from, even if it's their home computer, that you could set it up that you recognize who it is through some sort of criteria, and then it only allows them access to what they need to access, either company applications or file shares, for instance. Data protection. So security is all about layering. So you need to make sure, that you have, good antivirus software, that your devices are encrypted that you're using, that you have good email protection. The largest #1 attack for companies right now, for ransomware, is email. And it's somebody, you could have all the great technology in place that you want. It takes one person to inadvertently click on something in an email. And when that occurs, then it's what technology do I have in place to mitigate that attack that occurred. And there's things that can do that, from preventing that communication. Even though something was clicked on, it could prevent that communication, it could recognize it and prevent that communication from going back out to let the bad guys know that, hey, they clicked on it. So it never gets the encryption information coming back to encrypt those files, for instance. Endpoint protection. So this goes into, well, how do I know that I'm protecting the devices appropriately, right? So this could be company provided mobile devices. It could be, you allow personal phones. So there's protection that you could put in place and technology you could implement that does the basics. So for a good example here is a personal cell phone. You want them to be able to access company email. You want them to potentially access company applications. And then as a personal, on the personal side, they're worried of, well, what do they have access to? Or can they just wipe everything off my phone, like my pictures or my personal information? You can build what are called sandboxes that really isolates that a personal device, the only thing that the company has control over is the company data. So for instance, somebody leaves, you can just wipe that company data and it does not touch that personal device in any other way. Now, if the person lost their device, of course, we have the technology in place to remote wipe that device as a whole, which most likely in that case, the person would want that to happen anyways if they no longer have physical control over their device. So their personal data and the company data would be potentially at risk there. The biggest thing is training, education, and compliance. So when you have remote work you're using at home, everybody, you start off, you have to have good policy and procedures. That's one step. But just because policies exist, it doesn't necessarily mean people always know what's in those policies, or policies are changing. How do you manage that? So from a training perspective, this is, again, goes back into layers. I think it's important of building that security culture that you're always getting in front of, your employees, your business partners that you work with, even potentially customers in some cases, of how do you make sure that people are aware? So it's really awareness training, right? You want to make sure that people are aware that certain things may be a risk. So that could be as simple as external email coming in is flagged in a different color, or a banner that shows that's an external email versus internal. Might make you look at it a little bit different. Showing people what to look for. Because the reality is the bad guys are getting better and better, right? They're creating email messages, and I'm sure you've all received one, that look legitimate, look like they came from somebody within the company, look like they came from a customer. But you have to look for those little key type things. Are they asking me to do something out of sense of urgency? Are they asking me to, do something that is, maybe they're using language that's just a little different, or maybe that person wouldn't talk to you in that way. And I know it's hard because there isn't tone necessarily in email, but there's enough cues sometimes to really help with that. So the training is important. So the training that we do helps give you information around what to look for. Then there's the just ongoing, security updates and things like that. Compliance goes much deeper, right? Depending on your organization, and if you're an organization that is, somehow has regulations because you're a financial institution, a healthcare organization, or many other organizations have certain criteria that they have to meet from a regulatory body. You have to prove in most of those that you actually are doing some sort of level of security training, right? And actually across the board here on these different buckets, you have to prove that you're doing your due diligence, right? Down to the basics of, you have policies, you have procedures, and they're documented. Most companies fail and fall down on having good documented procedures. They might be doing it in operations, but they don't have good documented procedures in many cases. All the way to that you're showing that you're doing ongoing training and education around security and around compliance. So you have to have mechanisms in place to show that you're doing that. Going back to the remote workforce, one of the other big key items that companies deal with or have been questioned with is, how do I make sure they're being productive, right? If they're now working from home and they used to be working on premise, in the office, and how do I make sure that productivity level is the same? When it really gets down to it, there's if you have a problem employee, you have a problem employee, right? They're going to be a problem. If they're a problem employee, they're really probably a problem employee on premise, in the office, and remote. So that's one component of it, right? It doesn't absolve the manager aspect of employees. Now, you might have employees that just are wired a little bit differently, right, in the way that they work, and they need interaction. So you have to make sure, from a collaboration tool perspective, that you put good tools in place that allow all different personality types of employees and how they operate and work, giving them different avenues to be able to work, effectively, together. But there are tools that you can put in place for remote workforce that are multifaceted. So there's data loss. You've heard the term data loss prevention, potentially. Data loss prevention basically is you're preventing data loss, really what it comes down to. And in that, the tools can look for things like company information is, certain company information is accessed. You can get alerts on that. You can prevent it. If it's emailed, you can prevent it or alert upon it. You could look for key things like, maybe if you're a healthcare, I could go back to healthcare. If you're using a patient record number or a social security number, you could see those things, and you could prevent that data flow from occurring. So you prevent that data loss by putting in certain criteria. And a lot of those tools are built in today to various levels of Microsoft's licensing. So if you're already an Office 365 type client or leveraging that, it's usually just an uptick in your licensing level to gain some of the functionality. Data loss prevention tools also include that ability of potentially locking down the USB drives as well, so you just don't have people that can plug things in. But remote workforce, it also can limit their ability to print. So if you don't want somebody to print something or print screen something to their home computer from a security perspective, you can use those type of tools to put in place to limit that type of activity. Some of those data loss prevention tools also have productivity type monitoring tools. So you could also see, are people being productive? It uses AI in many cases to kind of see what they're accessing, what the trends are. Do you see that they're being productive? Again, those typically are used by organizations, not as a punishment tool, but just to get baselines from around general productivity to see how things are operating. I think the reality is most companies have not seen a drop in productivity from remote workforce that we've seen. If anything, they've seen the same and an uptick from some people, just because the flexibility that the remote capabilities bring to the table. So I know I've thrown a lot at you, around just the shift in technology, and this is something this is really could be talked about for hours, and diving into the weeds of each of these things. But really, if I wanted to leave you with one thing, it's really just changing the way you look at things. Don't get paralyzed in the fact that this shift is occurring, and it's going to occur with us or without us, and it's happening at a rapid pace at the moment. It's really going back to the fundamentals and breaking things down, and just really understanding how your workforce works, right? So what do they need to access? Who is accessing it? And how are they accessing it? Starting answering those questions, then you could start layering on technology to make sure that you have those capabilities in place that address all those other concerns around security, productivity, all those kind of things. But thank you for your time. If there's further questions, you can put them into the chat, and we'll stay on and answer whatever questions you might have. But I'm going to turn it back over to Darren to talk about the financial side of it.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
What we have found as we've gone through the past 9 months is that for the most part, our businesses that we see in this lower middle market space are falling into one of three categories. And essentially, about a third of our businesses are doing better than they were. So either they're in an industry that has benefited from some of the issues surrounding the pandemic, or they've taken action to leverage revenues and better cash flows. Another third are mildly impacted, and that is that their cash flow and their sales are less than 10% below where they were the same period last year. It is that bottom third, however, is where we have the struggle, and that is their sales and their cash flow is over 10% lower than it was same period last year. And another way of really thinking through this is, as you're running the business today, are you cash positive? Meaning that, are you generating cash from the business that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, month out? Or are you having to tap into your savings, your line of credit, or other instruments in order to pay the operating costs of running that business? And so that's kind of the first question that has to be answered by a business today, is taking stock of where are you. On the next slide, we start this discussion about, hey, let's take a harder look at our cash flow. After all, in a time of a crisis, in an economic downturn, cash flow is king. And so some of the tools that we've found helpful, or our clients have found helpful, is to have a rolling 12 months financial projection where they're projecting essentially their cash flow for the next 12 months. And in a more detailed level, it's just a rolling 13 weeks projection. And doing this too, it helps the owner get their hands around a very important piece of information, and that is, how does your average monthly cash flow compare to the available cash you have? And that's cash you have access to. So it can be what you have in the bank or your line of credit. By dividing the cash you have available by your average cash flow, that gives you essentially a key metric for today, especially in cases where the business is operating at a cash negative position. It tells you how many months of survival that business has. And most of our businesses today are targeting 12 months. So they are literally trying to reduce their expenses, increase their revenues, cash flow generations, or access to capital, so that they can have a sufficient flow of cash and access to capital to last them through the next 12 months. Next slide, please. Access to capital is a really critical issue today. And many of the businesses have already received a PPP loan, and quite frankly have already consumed the proceeds from those loans. However, if you have not applied, you should apply for an EIDL loan. You don't have to take it, but you should apply to determine what you qualify for. The second action that business should do is they should begin this process of reestablishing communications with their existing lender around perhaps extending some of the current debt instruments they have a little bit longer. Many of the banks gave you 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 months. Now it's time to kind of go back and say, hey, that was great. But what I'm looking for is maybe something a little bit longer, another 6 months. Or maybe I'm looking for a line of credit if I don't have one, or an increase to the line of credit. The important thing, though, that we should all keep in mind is, as we are going through this, the profile of many of our banks have changed, and especially that risk profile. So now more than ever, maybe a time to shop and look for other banks to see if they may become a yes where your current provider has been a no. The other thing that I would encourage businesses to do is really search for the municipality economic development agencies' websites, because they have grants that are popping up almost on a weekly basis. Now, what you shouldn't do, however, is search for grants over the internet, because there are far more scams than there are opportunities for you to get debt, grants or additional debt using some of the internet sites. So getting on the alert for those municipalities, especially the county, the state, and even the cities, can be a helpful instrument to take advantage of that. Additionally, if you have failed on that second bullet around getting your existing lender to move, or identifying new lenders, look for alternate lenders in that. Community development financial institutions such as ECDI that's located here in Central Ohio, they're excellent sources of funds. And from a micro lender perspective, or to get you through or get you to reach that access or that capital number that you need. The next slide, please. Many of our clients came to the conclusion that my culture, my core values are largely unchanged through this pandemic. However, my strategy is almost out of the window. So they've sort of started back on a ground zero and done a few things. And one of them is really taking a hard look at the goods and services that they offer to see if they should continue to offer them for the same price, or if there are other venues, avenues, or distribution channels that they should pursue in order to get the products to their clients. The best way to think of this is, as you're pruning the portfolio, so to speak, is to begin to think of your business as a startup and say, fundamentally, what's the best way for me to get my goods, my services directly to my client? The other thing is we've seen clients have a lot of success with adjusting to the virtual impact. So we've had clients that run training centers have moved to virtual trainings, changed and modified, and actually made their certification processes better. The other thing is a virtual reality allows you to have a broader geography as you're looking for employees. That's especially true when you have things like customer service, inside sales, positions like that. People can do from any part of the US or outside of the US. So that is another area that you can use to reach a broader audience of customers. The other thing that clients are doing, and they're seeing a great benefit from, is conducting customer interviews. It's helping them really understand where customers need new products, different products, or changes to the products. They've also been able to identify some areas where they can create recurring revenues, or in some cases, productize their services. A couple examples of that is we had a detailer that transitioned their detailing service to a product, and that product is a sanitation service. And so now, instead of you taking your car, dropping it off to be detailed, they come to your home, to your office, and essentially help to sanitize the vehicle, which includes, in many cases, changing the filters that some of the newer model cars have built in. So they've now just kind of created a product as opposed to the detailing service. They've created the sanitized product, and so they've gone from virtually having no clients in March to having a backlog of 2 to 3 weeks. On the next slide. The last piece kind of goes to a statement that many folks have probably heard before, and that is you should never waste a crisis. So as you have a crisis that occurs, one of the things you want to do is position your company to be better than it was before. And many of our clients are finding it helpful to revisit, as they did, their strategy, their strengths and their weakness, but most importantly, their opportunities. They're also changing kind of their work rules and their communication cadences to reflect the fact that there are folks now working remotely, or where they have people coming in having to set up processes to reinforce the PPE, because just because it's a rule in the workplace is sort of like safety. When it's not convenient, oftentimes people have a little bit of a problem adhering to it. And the other thing is on the personal risk side. Having coping check-ins, asking open-ended questions of folks that are working from home to gauge how they're doing, because the people are in fact the most valuable asset that we have, and they're going to help us generate our cash flow, increase our cash flow, and survive this pandemic. At FocusCFO, we provide fractional CFO service, and what that really means is we provide part-time management team members to businesses, and the focus of those members is just as any management team would help, and that is helping the owner, the business, be successful, tear their goals, long-range goals into smaller parts. Typically, we work with owners that are really worried about their cash flow, their profitability, because their business isn't as healthy as it once was, or they're overwhelmed by the pace of growth. And they really need someone that has gone through growth, has experience with putting in standard processes and systems that makes growth sustainable. And then lastly, they're just exhausted with all the hours they're putting in and not making much progress in terms of having that business move to the next level, so that they can one day monetize that business and leave it to their sons, their daughters, or the employees, or even sell it as that goes as well. And that's FocusCFO. That's what we do. And I'll turn it back to Cindy for questions.
Darren, appreciate it. This is Keith, and as you mentioned, yeah, we'd love to open up the last 10 minutes or so of our webinar today to questions. And again, encourage all of you, if you have any questions, to please type them in the sidebar. Do not be shy. And we do have a couple questions that have come in, and want to go ahead and start addressing them. And the first one goes to Brian at Revolution Group. Brian, question came in. You talked a little bit about cloud. When is the right time to move to the cloud?
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, that's a good question. So from a business side of things, there could be various drivers that would cause this. Traditionally, before kind of a pandemic, it would be it's time to upgrade hardware. So for instance, I have physical servers and they have aged and they're no longer, under warranty, and we're at a time now where I need to replenish that hardware. So that's or operating system. So that like the Windows operating system that is running on that server is no longer supported, and it's time to upgrade it. Those are usually drivers of, okay, I need to make a technology change due to a replenishment that needs to occur. So if I'm going to be making an investment in new hardware, new software, that's a perfect time for companies to take a look at of, well, let me do the cost comparison, right? To see, here's what it would cost to continue to run it with hardware versus moving out to the cloud. Sometimes it's a business driver. So an organization is bringing in a new, ERP system or CRM, and they have different choices on, does that software have to be run on equipment that I own, or can it be run out in the cloud on a software as a service? And then in the case of the pandemic, it was kind of forced upon us in the fundamental shift with being able to support our workforce that has now gone off remotely. And, how do we support those users, not only from connectivity, business continuity all came into play, disaster recovery, all those things came into play. So that was a driver. So there's multiple drivers, but I'd say those are the different decision points. Either it's forced upon you, kind of in the pandemic type state, or you have business drivers that are good points in time to take a look at the options. And it does vary based on business, so one is a capital expenditure and the other is an operating cost type model. So also depending on your business, your type of business might have a different appetite for the different kind of accounting aspect of it.
And actually piggybacking a little bit on the expense angle, is going to the cloud, generally speaking, less expensive for a business?
It can be. I like to not ever approach going to the cloud as being a cost savings versus kind of a cost, again, a cost shift. You going towards a cloud type infrastructure, you have more of a flatter cost typically, or a slower gradual rise in your costs because they're more predictable costs. They're usually licensing costs or consumption type costs. In a traditional type model, it goes in waves, right? So you buy a server and you buy software and you had that big expense up front. Well, then your expense might come down because to maintain it might be a little bit less, but then 4 to 5 years from now, when you have to replenish it, you're going to have this big wave again of an expenditure for new hardware and things like that. So again, I like to model these things out 3 to 5 years so you can really see the cost trends between both solutions and then kind of make that decision. But it's not, going to the cloud isn't a pure cost savings. It might help with predictability of your costs.
Got it. And final question, Brian, this one is also to you. You did touch upon this in your portion of the discussion today, but can you maybe readdress how do you manage productivity in the remote workforce?
Sure. So, myself being a manager, as well, and just having, staff in various roles, as I said, the productivity part is there's one aspect that's being, it's a manager's responsibility, right, to make sure that their employees are doing what they need to be doing. There's the management aspect of it. So I think what we've seen, and just generally speaking, I've had the opportunity, I sit on the local CIO forum, which is made up of CIOs from, everything from Nationwide to Cardinal to, you name it, right, here in town. And we have these conversations, and we've been having a lot of these conversations with regards to the shift of the workforce working from home and how do you manage them and productivity coming along with that. So you can put tools in place, that can monitor, applications, and how much time are they actually logged in? How much time are they in particular applications? What are they doing within applications? So there are tools that can gather that information and kind of give you a percentage of, based on a given work day and hours, here's what we think their productivity rate is. The best way to do it in an organization that I have found is just run off your KPIs, right? I mean, your key performance indicators, whatever those are for whatever you're doing, those are really your driver, right? Do you have company KPIs that people are hitting? Do you have individual goals? The concept of everybody having a number, right? Are they hitting those goals? Well, if they're hitting those goals, well, then you could, that's one thing. If they're not hitting those goals, that's a lot harder conversation, but then you could take it back into, is it, their work environment that they're in now at home? Are they just not staying focused? And then you could start using that information as a manager to manage them appropriately, individual by individual if needed. So I guess that's how you could either do it through tools, Keith, or you could do it through, again, setting numbers and goals and using key performance indicators to run your business, right down to the individual level.
Yeah, makes sense. Appreciate that, Brian. That's all the questions we have at this point during our webinar today. If you have any other questions that come up after the call today, we have a slide on your screen now with both Brian and Darren's information. I highly encourage you to write this down if you have any interest in discussing either technology needs with Revolution Group and Brian, or financial topics with Darren at FocusCFO. Please do reach out to them directly. They'd be happy to coordinate a time to talk to you. With that, I wanted to thank Darren and Brian again, and I want to thank everyone who registered and attended our webinar today. We appreciate your time and hope you found this valuable. Have a great rest of your week.